looks like we have a nice crowd. Good morning, guys. Oh, and an upside down class. That's fun. I think we still have a few more minutes, so we'll wait and see if we get a few more participants here today. But I'm glad you guys are joining us, nice and warm and toasty in your classrooms. We're talking about how it's just getting colder today. It's a perfect day to be Zooming.
Thank you, Miss Holland. And also a little reminder for all my teachers, in case you haven't been in one of my Zooms before, it's extremely helpful for me to have what school you're from, as well as how many students are attending today. I want to stay here in Marion County, and having these numbers help me do that. So all I ask for is that your name, what school you're from, as well as how many students.
What do you think, Alan? Should we get started?
Yeah, I think we can go ahead and get started.
All
Would you like to take it away?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Erin Benavides, and I'm the resource teacher at Silver River Museum. We are so happy to have you joining us. If you have paper and pencil, students, you might want to draw a giant Venn diagram, because today we're going to be comparing and contrasting two different trees from two different environments.
So the first tree we're going to talk about is this pine tree here behind us, or really all of these pine trees. And so where I am currently is in, let me admit someone else. There we go. So we're currently in a sandhill, and sandhills are kind of known for their longleaf pines, which is what many of these trees are here behind me. But Erin is in a swamp, vastly different from a sandhill. So let's see what's down there.
All right, so this swamp is really, really wet. It is right at the edge of the Silver River. And in case we didn't mention it, we're in Silver Springs State Park. So while the museum is closed, you guys can visit these locations that we're at in the state park. And it might be hard to tell on the screen, but behind me is water, and I'm standing in muck. It's a good thing I'm wearing boots today. And the tree that dominates the swamp is known as the bald cypress tree. So if you look behind me, directly behind me, that very large tree, the tallest tree you'll see out here, is a bald cypress tree. And so today what we want to do is we want to compare and contrast the bald cypress tree in the swamp ecosystem or habitat with the longleaf pine tree in the sandhill. And so we're going to start from the bottom of the tree and we're going to go up. So let's start with the roots. Alan, do you want to describe the roots of the pine tree?
Of course. So as Erin was saying, she's in muck, and I'm not in muck. My ground is pretty solid. And so it's really interesting about this spot is this is one of the highest spots in the state park. And anyway, water is further to get to. And so while you're at the swamp, water is pretty close by. Water here is pretty hard to get to. And so what our trees have to do is do a really deep tap root, or just a root that goes straight down to collect some of that water. Since the ground's nice and solid, they don't need a bunch of roots spreading out. They just need to get water eventually. So they have one big root going down and a few smaller roots for a little bit of stability.
Out here in the swamp, water's not a problem. There's usually water on this ground year round. Sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less. But what is an issue is this ground is really soft. If you've ever walked in mud, you know that you could fall down pretty easily. So if you look at all these little things poking up behind me, they kind of look like stumps, don't they? But they're not stumps. They are roots, and they're specialized roots of these bald cypress trees. They're called Cypress Knees. I have one right here that you can kind of look at up close. This one was removed when they were building the boardwalk out here. And so these roots actually poke up above the muck and above the water level. So, in addition to getting water and nutrients like all roots do, these roots have another really important job, and that's to help hold these trees up. Obviously, these trees get really big in mucky soil, they need a lot of support. So, these cypress knees are the specialized roots that help support them.
So now let's move up slightly from the roots and we'll go ahead and talk about the trunk. Um, so a pine tree trunk, specifically the longleaf pine tree, is perfectly straight. I don't know if you can see that tree behind Erin, and it has this big bottom to it, or a buttress. But these trees have a trunk that's pretty much straight, the same size all the way up. Now, in an upland habitat or in a sandhill where we are here, um, fire is something that happens pretty often. It's not a bad thing to happen in a sandhill. It's just something that happens pretty often. And since pine trees live here, they've adapted with the fire to where their bark and their trunk is fire resistant. There's this waxy layer and their leaves, which we'll talk about later, but the trunk itself can withstand fire pretty often. What are some of the problems that happen in a swamp?
So, there's not often fires in the swamp. So, the bald cypress tree doesn't need armor for its bark. And in fact, if we look at this knee, you can kind of see the bark is pretty thin, but it's wet. And think about what happens to wood in water. It can rot. So it's really important that the wood making up the trunk of the bald cypress tree is rot resistant. So also, like Alan mentioned, the bottom of the trunk is shaped kind of like this, right? It's a lot wider at the bottom, and that is called a buttress, and that helps support it. So the trunk of the bald cypress tree not only offers more support because it's growing in this mucky soil, but it's also rot resistant because there's water here pretty much all year long.
Moving up from the trunk, we can then get into the leaves. Now, for both the cypress tree and the longleaf pine, they have what's called needles. Now, our needles will look different, but I just wanted to go and show you what a longleaf pine's needle looks like. So, pretty needle-like, but on these needles is a bunch of wax. And what's really neat about this wax is it also helps with the pine tree being fire resistant. So whenever a pine tree is growing, all of this waxiness on the leaves protects the new growth of the tree so that it doesn't burn down.
So, Alan, how long would you say the needles for that longleaf pine are in length?
It's across my chest, so I'd say over a foot long, maybe almost 2 feet long sometimes.
Yeah, which is how it got its name, longleaf pine. Now, the bald cypress tree also has needles, but if you notice, when you look up that tree, you don't see them on the tree this time of year. So, unlike a lot of other trees with needles, they're not evergreen. The pine trees are evergreen, they keep their needles all year round. These bald cypress trees are bald this time of year. They lost their needles, but I have some preserved. This is what they look like. Unlike the pine tree, they're small. Look how short they are, and they grow in leaflets. So many needles all together on a leaflet.
So the next thing I want to talk about is reproduction. So the way that plants reproduce, or at least these pine trees and cypress trees reproduce, is through cones. So pine trees and cypress trees are conifers, which means that they grow cones. What's really interesting is both the cypress and the pine tree have male and female cones. So you may have seen a female pine cone. So this is a female pine cone, and it opens up, and in the base of all of these little sprouts that come out is where the seed is, or at least the female seed. But there's a whole nother cone for where the male seeds are. So I challenge you to go outside, not this time of year, but maybe another time of year, and find some male cones, because they're not around right now. If you can't find them outside, I also suggest you go and try to look up what a male pine cone even look like. It's way different.
So the bald cypress tree also has cones, but you might not recognize it if you were walking out here in the swamp. This is what their cone looks like a little round ball. And like the pine tree, it has scales, but these scales don't poke out. They're flat and they kind of come together like puzzle pieces. And what happens, this is the female cone. The male cone produces the pollen. The pollen will fertilize the female cone, which makes the seeds. So there's seeds inside of this ball. This ball falls to the ground here in the swamp, and it turns brown like this, and then it breaks open. And when you break this open, you find the seeds. And this is what one of the seeds looks like. Now, what's interesting is these seeds need water. The water is how they're dispersed. And while I'm talking about seeds, Alan, if you want to move to your next location, you can. So these seeds require the water. When the water levels come up, when the swamp floods, the seeds get moved and then they can germinate. And they like to be wet when they germinate. Now, the longleaf pine tree, those seeds get dispersed a different way. The pine cones stay up in the tree. The wind will catch those seeds and bring them down to the ground, but they don't like water. The pine cones actually have a defense mechanism where if it's too wet, they'll close up and the seeds won't be released. Because if the pine tree seeds are released on wet ground, they rot and they never grow into a tree. So we've talked about a lot of different structures of these trees, and we've compared them between the two different habitats. But here's what's interesting. Sometimes a plant's structure depends on where it's growing. So Alan just moved, and he's in the sandhill where there's actually a bald cypress tree growing. So I want to hear from Alan. How is that bald cypress tree in the sandhill similar to these in the swamp, and how is it different?
So let's start out with what's similar. If you could look up the tree, again, all of the leaves are gone, just like the cypress tree was in the swamp. There's also a few cones up there that are way too high for me to go and show you, but they do have the cones still. The bark, same really thin bark, but what's different about this trunk is it doesn't have a buttress that comes out. Remember that buttress really helps with water. There's also no knees around. Again, we talked about how those knees are very important for water. So it is kind of interesting about this tree overall is maybe it could be responding to the stimuli of water to grow those knees. So since there's no sitting water here in the sandhill, it doesn't have a need for those knees.
All right. So not only does it not have the knees if it's growing in a dry ecosystem, but it doesn't have the buttress root, which tells us sometimes a plant's structure, its parts, depends on where it's growing. All right, I think we're ready to open it up for questions. And here's how we're going to do questions, guys, because we have quite a few classrooms joining us. We're going to ask that you stay on mute and you have your teachers type the questions in chat. All right, and we will answer as many as we can during this session. So go ahead and start typing in those questions. And I'm gonna switch my camera around and try and give you a panorama view of the swamp while we are typing in questions. It's a pretty cool place. You can see the standing water there and lots of cypress trees. And fortunately today, I haven't seen any of the reptiles that will sometimes be in the swamp. It's a nice cool day, so they're staying warm somewhere. All right, Alan, do we have any questions?
We do. Before I go and answer the questions, I wanted to go and also do a little panorama to go and show that the only trees that have leaves right now are those pine trees. Every other tree here, you can see it's just vacant of leaves. There's no leaves. Now, if I go over to where the pine trees are, it still has its leaves. And then all these other trees have lost their leaves, except for my lone little palm tree. All right, now I'll go.
Palmettos in both the swamp and the sandhill.
All right, so I do have a few questions. How do the knees not rot?
So that's a good question. Just like the tree itself, the knees have that rot-resistant wood, and it has to do with the resins that plant produces, that the cypress tree produces. Now, it's kind of a catch-22 for the cypress tree because as soon as people realize, hey, these trees don't rot, they started wanting them for their lumber. And so many of the cypress trees in Florida were cut down in the late 1800s, early 1900s by loggers. If we had cypress trees from that time, we'd have cypress trees that were over 1,000 years old. They can grow up to 120 feet tall, be more than 6 feet around the base. But many of those old growth cypress trees have been cut down for that rot resistant wood.
Comparing that to the pine tree, it isn't rot resistant. It grows really straight, so it would be really good for lumber, and it is used for lumber in other ways, but not being rot resistant made it less favorable for different things. Now, Erin had mentioned that these cypress trees can grow to be 6 feet wide and 120 feet tall. Comparing that to our pine trees can grow to about 120 feet tall as well, but they stay rather narrow, only being maybe 3 foot wide at their oldest age. Now, for our next question is, how do seeds grow in trees? So the way I like to think of, I'll talk about cones first. So the cones grow in the trees kind of like the same way that other flowers grow their flower. It's for reproduction. Now, the cone itself is not the seed. Inside that cone is where you'll find all the different seeds. So behind each of those little like plates that you saw on the cypress tree or on the little pine cone, that's where the seeds are. So those seeds aren't really growing in the tree. It's once it combines with a male and female seed, like the pollen of the male seed, that's never actually starts to grow into a real seed that's going to sprout a tree. Next question is, how do trees adapt when there isn't enough water to survive? So in areas where water is abundant close to the surface, lots of roots will come out this way to collect water rather shallow. But in really deep water areas, like in a sand hill, they make really deep roots to collect their water.
And I want to add something to that. Adapt is a caution word, okay? I couldn't take a pine tree and put it in the swamp and have it adapt. It can't grow here. It doesn't have the structure that it needs to grow in this wet environment. So all plants need water. If they can't get enough water because they don't have the right structures, they won't survive. They'll die. But we know that things like the cypress tree have adapted or have adaptations like the knees that poke up to allow them to survive in wet environments.
Right. I could never adapt to have wings, but I've adapted to be really smart. And so depending on what species you are, so these are different species of trees, depending on what kind of species you are, you're better at different things. So cypress trees are really good at collecting water close up, but a pine tree can never grow that way. It just changes on how they grow.
Okay, what's next, Alan?
Yes. How do pine trees lose all their needles? Or how do pine trees not lose all their needles? So that goes back to the adaptations of pine trees had different structures, like they're able to hold on to water, and that's why they don't need to lose their leaves. They can lose some leaves, but they'll never lose all of them, really.
Yeah, and one of the things about wintertime is plants typically get less water and less direct sunlight during the winter. And so for some plants, it's important that they take those nutrients and they store them inside other parts of the tree, and they won't go through photosynthesis during the winter because they can't collect enough moisture and they can't collect enough sunlight. But those pine trees grow so tall, they can get plenty of sunlight. They're in open areas and their roots grow so deep that they're tapped into that water table pretty well. And they can continue to get water and they can continue to go through photosynthesis even in the wintertime.
So going through a few of these questions rather quickly, because we touched on a few of them. Why does one tree need water and others don't? They all need water. It just depends on how they get their water. That's what's different about them. The next question was, how do cypress trees in the swamp differ from those in the sandhill? Well, we talked about it here, where this tree is a cypress tree. It doesn't have the thick bottom like a buttress, or of the buttress. There's also no knees. So that's how they differ between the swamp and the sandhill. The swamp has that bigger buttress and the knees.
And
Next question. Oh, go
Here's
ahead.
can I say something interesting about that? That cypress tree probably started growing there in the state park when they were not doing controlled burns. It had to get big enough so that its branches weren't going to be burned by the controlled burns that happen out here. If there was a cypress tree planted out there today, it probably wouldn't survive the first controlled burn that came through there, because unlike the pine tree, it doesn't have fire resistant bark. So that bald cypress tree is kind of a lucky exception to the rule.
Which ties in perfectly to the next question. If a pine tree is fire resistant, how come it can catch fire? So yes, pine tree is used for whenever you have a bonfire, you go and have a fireplace, you oftentimes can use pine. And that's because that bark of a pine tree is what's fire resistant. The inside of that the tree is not so fire resistant. So you can use it once you've cut it up, but that outside is just so fire resistant that whenever a controlled burn comes through, whenever a wildfire can come through, because that's happened in the past, these pine trees can withstand that heat.
And let's just know the difference. The controlled or prescribed burns are very small flames. They are less intense of a fire, and they're healthy for that ecosystem. Wildfires tend to be hotter, and wildfires can kill the pine trees if the blaze is hot enough and long enough. We saw that out in California. So while they're fire resistant, because they protect the wood on the inside, pine trees aren't fireproof, which is one of the reasons why that ecosystem needs frequent control burns. So they're low intensity fires, not raging bonfires.
Right, and to build on that, one little bit I want to add is if you have regular prescribed burns or fire comes through an area often, then there's not a bunch of underbrush. So you can see there's a little bit of grasses growing, but if this catches on fire, it'll never build big enough to burn down an entire tree. But if you wait long times in between those prescribed burns, bigger things can grow underneath those pine trees that will catch way more fire and eventually burn down those trees. So having very often prescribed burns keeps it low, controlled, and keeps your house safe. Because let's just say you live out in the national forest where you're surrounded by trees, prescribed burns keep your home safe so that you don't get caught up in that. How do the seeds get in the pine cones? That's just how it grows. So you think about, like, you eat green beans, inside of that fruit or that vegetable, think about apples and stuff like that, the seeds are on the inside. It's kind of the same thing with a pine cone, where the seeds on the inside of the pine cone, once the pine cone opens up, then the seeds are exposed to get the male cone to be involved. If you had a collection of pine cones, could you grow your own trees? If you had both male and female pine cones, then yes, you could go and start growing some trees.
Well, and once on the female pine cone, once that egg or ovum has been fertilized by the pollen and the seed actually develops, then you have a seed that can grow. And while, yes, you could technically grow your own pine tree from a seed, you have to be really careful about the conditions, because they're really picky about the temperature and moisture level in their soil. But it's certainly something you could do. Now, you can't just plant a pine cone. You'd have to actually dissect the pine cone and get the seeds out.
As for the pine trees being,
go ahead.
Okay, after the pine trees being are very specific in what they need, that is very true. And think about how many pine cones you see just around your house or in your schoolyard versus how many pine trees there are. There can be hundreds of pine cones, but if that seed doesn't get what it needs, it's not going to grow. So they're very specific in what they need.
So I saw a couple questions about the male and female cones, and how do you tell the difference, and why don't we see the male cones right now? So the male cones are actually pretty fragile, and as soon as they release their pollen and fall to the ground, they kind of get broken down into the soil. So it'd be really tricky for us to find one right now. The male cones are pollen bearing, and here's what I recommend. I recommend you actually do a Google image search for those male cones, and I bet you anything you'll recognize them when you see a picture of them. but they probably don't look like what you'd predict they look like.
Right. Next question is, why do the trees not sink in the mud? I think it's a good example with your knees if you want to go and use that.
Yeah. So right now I'm out in the swamp wearing boots. Okay. I wouldn't come out here in a pair of stiletto heels. Imagine the stiletto heel was my root, right? If it was a tree root, it would poke right down into the ground and sink. But when I take my weight and distribute it evenly, then I don't sink as much. It's almost like snowshoes, which probably most of us have not experienced, or elephants, the fact that they have really big hooves, so their weight is distributed over a big area. These knees help distribute that weight and support it and keep it anchored to the ground, as well as those buttress roots, those big wide roots. It's almost like big wide elephant feet. So the wide roots and the roots that poke up are the support, why it doesn't sink.
All right, the next question is, do trees have the same size roots? So I was thinking about a good way of explaining this, and it's almost like a tree is like a dumbbell. So think about how it has a lot of stuff on one side, skinny in the middle, and a lot of stuff on the other side. It's the same way for trees. Trees have a skinny middle for their trunk, or a straight middle for their trunk, and they'll have a bunch of branches out on the outside. So it's the same thing underground. You'll have a few big roots underground, and then you'll have little leaflets or like the branches underground as well, to help search for water and get the nutrients from the ground. So they don't have the same size roots, but every tree pretty much has big roots close to the tree trunk and then spreads out smaller as you get further away. What animals need those trees for their homes?
Ooh, that's a good question. So let's talk about.
I think I'll go first because I have a lot more animals than you do. For pine trees, you have squirrels and a bunch of birds that call it home. But if I was to go and show you up above me, let's see if I can see myself. Up above me, there's relatively not very many trees blocking the sky. And so what's really cool is birds of prey. So like hawks and falcons, they will fly above these open areas, and they'll look for rabbits going through the ground or squirrels. So it's really good for them to be able to hunt. So we have a lot of animals that hunt in these upland areas or sandhills.
So, like those big tall pine trees, the birds of prey also like the bald cypress trees. This is a place where we might find hawks, eagles, osprey. They're going to make their nest. The river's really close by. They're going to be able to get food out of the river. But in addition, some smaller critters like these Cypress Knees, and they're going to hide in the Cypress Knees. So things like if they're in the water, we can have amphibians and reptiles, and even things like wood ducks will find their food and hide all along these submerged roots. And the squirrels like the cones as well.
Right. What time of year can you find the male and female pine cones? So lots of things start to sprout or start to grow in the spring. Think about whenever you think of spring, you think of flowers blooming. It's the same thing for pine trees or for cypress trees, where they'll start to grow their cones in the spring. Summer comes around, you'll start to go and get the seeds to start to sprout and grow a little bit. By October, like late fall, you have little sprouts that are breaking the surface.
Yeah. And when you start to see that yellow dust collect on your cars out in your driveway or the parking lot, you know the pollen's out. Start looking for the pollen cones.
Do humans harvest these types of trees for anything? So yes, longleaf pine was actually the flooring of my middle school growing up. So it's used for flooring in the past. It's used for 2x4s and lumber of all sorts of stuff. But Erin has some really interesting stuff about cypress tree uses in the past.
Yeah, so you can actually look up images from the late 1800s, early 1900s of people harvesting these cypress trees. They were huge, massive trees, and they'd use the river to float them down to the mill. And they would use cypress knees for all sorts of things, whether it was furniture making, lumber for home building, roof shingles, because they were water resistant. So you could still buy cypress mulch. If I'm being a good steward of my environment, though, I'm going to choose a different kind of mulch because I know these are really slow growing trees and I want to keep them here. They're vital for the swamp ecosystem. 99% of our swamp in Florida has disappeared, mostly because of humans using these trees and filling in the swamp.
Next question is, do fish live in that swamp?
You know, it would be pretty tricky to find fish. And one of the reasons is the oxygen level of the swamp water is pretty low. The fish like the river better. So we have lots of small critters like little shrimp and crayfish, and there could be tadpoles sometimes. But fish, not so much because they want the highly oxygenated water of the river.
Do animals need pine cones? So pine cones are one food source for lots of different animals. So you think about it, if you put a bird feeder outside, you'll have plenty of different seeds in there. It'll look like a smorgasbord of all the different seeds. You'll have sunflower seeds and all sorts of stuff. Pine cones, the seeds there are just one source of food for a lot of different animals.
Yeah, but one of the things it is good for, if squirrels are kind of like, I don't know if you've heard about rabbits and other animals whose teeth keep growing and they need to gnaw them down. And so when they gnaw on those pine cones, it serves another purpose too. It helps grind down their teeth. So Alan, I'm looking at our clock here and it looks like we've spent 30 minutes talking about this already.
Yes, we
Um,
did.
so if your students have more questions that we have not answered, shoot us an email, send them an email and we will respond and we'll be sure they get their questions answered. But I am so glad you guys could join us out here in the swamp.
And also here in the Sand Hill. It was lovely to see everyone. Hope to see you again soon.
All right. Thank you guys. Bye.
Bye.